Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Annie and Kate. Hello, Annie.
Hey, Kate. How are you going?
Good, thank you. And welcome to our guest, Anna Fifield.
Hello from New Zealand.
So Anna is the editor of the Dominion Post and Wellington editor of Stuff in New Zealand, but she has a long career as a foreign correspondent for Washington Post and served as bureau chief in Beijing and Tokyo, and previously worked for the Financial Times for 13 years, reporting from countries including Iran, Syria, North Korea, and the US. And she was also a Nieman Fellow for Journalism at Harvard, about how change happens in closed societies. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Now, Annie, what are you drinking?
I have weird, right? And I'm saying this is going to sound weird, but it's a Cabernet Sauvignon, but it's Tuscan. I don't remember Italy being particularly famous for Cab Sauv, but it's very nice.
Anna, what are you drinking?
I am drinking a glass of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, chilled. It's after 8 o'clock here, so I reckon
very, very on brand.
Yes, that's right.
and I am drinking a can of Gordon's gin and tonic because I'm still in the office, and it was all I had in the fridge, and it's left over from last year.
Well, look, clearly it needed drinking. And before we go any further, please introduce the extra addition to today's podcast.
This is my new puppy. He's a Chihuahua. He doesn't have a name yet.
So my contributions for said name have thus far been Hamish, which is terribly sensible, Lucifer, and Genghis.
Oh, what kind of life are you setting up a dog for if you call him Genghis or Lucifer?
Or Lucifer, yeah.
Or Hamish. Hamish is not a name for a dog.
In fairness, I actually do prefer the other two names other than Hamish. Good name, but you know, I like the idea of a small dog having some sort of despotic tendencies.
I worry about nominative determinism myself, but that's just me.
And Anna, I think we saw a floof somewhere in your vicinity as well. Has the floof disappeared?
Sitting next to me on the floor next to the heater. So at Easter, we got 2 cats from the SPCA. They're brother and sister called Odin and Freya. So now it feels like our home is complete.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, they're only 3 months old, so they're a bit older than kittens, but still very, very playful.
Beautiful. Any house without an animal doesn't quite feel like home, I don't think.
Anyway, so Annie, do you want to ask your first question?
I shall. I'm going to go for the one that I often ask, which is, Anna, if you could go back to your younger self, it could be yourself at school, university, the first part of your career, doesn't matter. But if you could go back to your younger self and give one piece of advice, what advice would you give to your former self?
I would tell my former self not to be so serious and conservative, because I hesitate to say this because I don't mean conservative as in politically, but I went from high school to university when I was still 17 years old. I was young for my year, and then I finished my university. I went to journalism school. And then I got my first job before I'd even finished the year. So I finished like a week early and off I went. And I always had the next job lined up. I mean, in many ways, you know, I've been so fortunate that things have fallen into place and I've gone from great job to great job and things. But I often regret that I didn't have that kind of gap year, or I didn't just throw caution to the wind and set off to Bulgaria or somewhere and just see where the world would have taken me. So I guess that I feel like I have been too safe and always plotting my course. I mean, I never plotted 5 steps ahead, but I never leapt without having something to go to.
I can confirm, by the way, Bulgaria is lovely. I worked there for a couple of years on a random job. So that's just by the by.
Yeah.
How about you, Kate? What's your question for Anna?
I wanted to ask Anna, because, you know, having been a journalist, what is your favorite tool? It could be any kind of thing. It doesn't have to be a power tool or a drill or anything. What is your favorite tool in your entire life?
So I think the tool that made me feel most powerful was during the year I spent at Harvard, as you talked about before, being a Nieman Fellow. Yeah, so my first semester, I was very serious, and I went to like classes on Middle Eastern politics and blah, blah, and was really studying hard there. And then I just kind of thought, I'm never going to get another opportunity like this ever again, to experiment and to do things I would never otherwise do. So in the second semester, I enrolled in this painting class, a studio painting class, in this amazing Corbusier building at Harvard. Like, how lucky was I? I had my own easel and things, but we would go to the wood shop and make our own frames and canvases and things. And so I just remember spending lots of time down there with the various saws and power tools and making my frames. I've still got all my digits, and then stretching my canvases and painting. And I was a really horrific painter. Like, there was I'm not being modest when I say there was no talent that I unlocked during that time, but I enjoyed it so much, because it was something I'd never done before and probably would never do again. And it was just something, there were no words, there were no, I don't know, there was no writing, there was no reading or anything. It was just me and trying to be creative. So I really loved that time. And I spent a lot of time in that studio just splashing paint around and then ripping the canvas off and doing it all again.
So, I mean, that's a really interesting insight, because the whole rest of your life seems to have been about words. So did you get any useful insights into yourself when you were doing that?
Yeah, it's really funny because I did definitely notice this at the time, and this is 2013, 2014, but it wasn't until I moved home 6 months ago that kind of things clicked into place, and that everything I did during the course of that year during the course of that semester, and the painting had something to do with New Zealand. I drew the splotchy map of New Zealand. I wove together canvas and painted it green so it looked like a Māori basket and things. And so everything in some way, and I joked at the time thinking, oh, clearly I'm homesick or something. And I'd been away for 13 years by then and things, but it seemed to be telling me something. And it took me a long time to listen to that until last year, when suddenly I'm like, it's time to go home.
And what pushed you over the edge, Anna? What was the thing that said, this is the moment, I need to go now?
Yeah, it was a real confluence of events, I think. And at the beginning of last year, I wasn't thinking of coming home at all. I'd been away for 20 years, and it wasn't that I was not thinking of coming home. I just, I was working for the Washington Post. I thought that I would return to Washington, where I'd previously been, and that would be my future path. And I felt so lucky. I loved working at the Washington Post. But then over the course of last year, I mean, first of all, there was COVID, but that wasn't really so much of a factor. But then in March last year, 16 American journalists were kicked out of China, and with a few days' notice. I was given a reprieve because I'm not American. But then things just got progressively tighter and more difficult, and journalists started getting arrested. 2 Australian journalists had to seek refuge in their embassy, and things just became more and more, felt like they were dangerous. And I am a solo parent in a pandemic, on like 16 hours away from my family, and I was like, I can't be getting arrested right now. Or detained.
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, so I thought that sooner rather than later, I would either have to leave or be forced to leave China. And looking at the US and what was happening, not with Trump so much, I mean, because I knew Trump wouldn't be there forever, but just the polarization and the toxic environment in the US and the way the Supreme Court has been stacked for decades to come, just made me think, I don't want to go back to the US. I don't want to raise my child as an American. I want him to grow up as a New Zealander. And so at that same time, I got offered this great job in New Zealand, plus the world was shut down for COVID. And it was, I took my son back to China, and we were in the quarantine hotel. And he asked me if we could adopt a 9-year-old girl so that he had a sister to go through these things with. And I was like, it's time. It's time to go and get a backyard and a trampoline and not go anywhere. So here we are.
And look, there are worse places to go back to. So you're in Wellington, which is one of my favourite cities in the whole of New Zealand. In fact,
Mine too.
Probably, yeah, like on my top 5 around the world as well, because there is no more beautiful day than the glittering blue day in Wellington. It's gorgeous. Has that always been your hometown, or was Wellington new to you as well?
Yeah, no, I grew up in Hastings, which is about 4 hours up the road, a provincial city town. But I went to university here. So when I left home at 17, this is where I came, and I worked here for a few years before I went overseas. So this is what I consider my home, and I've still got a lot of good friends from my university days here, and everything's very familiar. So it was easy to come back here. Yeah.
So lucky to have that beautiful, beautiful landscape on your doorstep.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating that you sort of, your psyche knew you wanted to come back before you did.
Yeah, and it was just like last year I was thinking, wow, I really feel like myself again in a way that I hadn't realized I didn't feel like myself before. And I don't really know how to unpack that or what that really means, but it just suddenly felt right to be home.
So how did you end up being a journalist going to all these fascinating spots like Iran and North Korea and China?
Yeah. I always wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and when I was a teenager growing up and watching the New Zealand foreign correspondents on TV, I was like, wow, what an amazing job. You get paid to travel around and go to these exciting places and ask questions. So I always wanted to do that. And when I arrived at the Financial Times in 2000, I'd only been there like a year, and I applied for the job of Belgrade correspondent, which of course I didn't get, but I had an interview and I obviously made a good impression on them, because then after 3 years, our Australia correspondent was pregnant and they needed somebody cheap and flexible to go and cover maternity leave for 6 months. And there I was. So they sent me off to Sydney for 6 months, and I knew that was my big break and my opportunity to prove myself. And so I spent 6 months there working crazy hours, and I went to all parts of Australia and wrote stories about mining and gambling and yachting and all sorts of different things to show versatility. And that stood me in good stead, because when I went back to London, they offered me the job in Korea. So off I went.
And what was Korea like? I'm
just going to ask the same thing.
Yeah, well, it was South Korea. But I'd never been anywhere in Asia before. I'd never eaten kimchi, nothing. So off I went. I mean, it was really fun. And I think it was a great first correspondent job, because it's not that important, it's not China. So if I missed something, it wasn't the end of the world. But also there was so much range. So like I could write about North Korean human rights, then the next day write about the film industry, and then go and visit some like semiconductor plant or something. So it was very, very interesting and fun. And I really kind of clicked with Korea and Koreans in a way that I hadn't expected. That Koreans are very like to stereotype an entire nation, but very forthright, very blunt about things, and living out loud all the time. And so I felt like I really fitted in there, so it was good.
And then obviously you've mentioned that you've recently come back from China. We hear quite a lot about China, particularly here in Australia, and not all of it good. How do you think we should be listening to journalists about what's going on in China versus what we hear in perhaps mainstream media?
Yeah, I mean, I feel really conflicted in answering this, in that I went to China having had a background writing about North Korea and being a big proponent of engagement as a way to help countries change, help people change their own countries, and had been thinking that if North Korea was able just to open up a little bit and people could see the outside world and interact with the outside world a bit more, maybe that would make a difference there. But so I went to China with the same kind of idea, and it was very confronting, because the Chinese Communist Party has really tightened up so much over the past 3 years, in particular, 3-4 years, with what the leader Xi Jinping is trying to do in terms of make China great again, basically, for want of a better phrase, but with what he's doing in terms of control inside the country and cracking down on lawyers and dissidents and journalists and ethnic minorities, all to varying degrees. You know, they have complete control over the internal message now, all of the social media platforms, all of the normal media platforms. So China has changed a lot, and for the worse. And so I left actually feeling pretty pessimistic about China and the prospects for change there, and for, you know, the bargain that the West had with China. You know, the calculation that they've made was that with economic reform and opening would come political change eventually, or political easing, and that hasn't been the case at all. It's going back in the other direction, so that now we see China looking more and more authoritarian, Xi Jinping looking more and more authoritarian. And so what I was writing about them seemed to be much more in that vein, and the things I love to write about, which is the human stories, and the kind of shared things that we all have in common, just became impossible to do, because when you would go out in China and try to report on things, you'd inevitably get detained by the local security services, or you'd put in danger ordinary people. You know, if you want to talk to a mum about how she's educating her kid or something like that, and then the police come knocking, you know, she has to explain why she was talking to an American journalist, which is what I was considered to be. So I couldn't do the kind of stories I wanted to write there. So it does give me pause, because I think that a lot of the rhetoric in the outside world, particularly in the United States and Australia, has engendered some anti-Chinese sentiment about people. And this is not about the people. This is about the Communist Party that's controlling them, or was trying to control them, trying to run the place. So yeah, so I guess 2 years in China turned me into a China hawk. That's what I'm saying.
Two startups that I did with China turned me into a China hawk.
Yeah. I just can't see what's going to turn it back in the other direction.
Well, Xi Jinping dying and somebody with a different opinion. But I think it's pretty much, I think it's pretty much the entire leadership are behind him, and they're flexing their muscles in really quite scary ways. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, all the Five Eyes intel seems to point to we're going to have a confrontation with them in the not too distant future. Do you think that?
I think it's in no one's interest to have a confrontation. I mean, I have been quite afraid about an accidental confrontation in terms of the action on the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and think that the prospects for miscalculation are quite high. People were quite worried towards the end of the Trump administration that Trump would go out with a bang and do something to China, you know, or probably over Taiwan. Taiwan is really the tip of the spear, or whatever. You know, this is where any conflict is going to happen, I think. I hope not. I hope that they'll be able to restrain themselves. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what was going to happen there.
Yeah. There's plenty of interesting spots around the world geopolitically.
Yeah,
that's incredibly true, and Kate will know this as well, because I can't remember the exact name of the course that you're studying for, Kate, but I know it's on terrorism, so I'm pretty confident you know of some other interesting spots too.
Mm-hmm. Terrorism and security I'm studying, so
there you go.
My friends keep joking that I'm learning to be a terrorist, but I already know how to be a terrorist.
Glad you took the words right out of my mouth. So I'm gonna switch tack a little bit, if that's okay, Anna. So you've obviously known. Did you know from like when you were super little and super young that you always wanted to be a journalist, or was writing always in your blood? How did that come about?
Certainly reading was always in my blood. I was always a big reader as a child. But yeah, I remember, being as a child, I wanted to be an astronaut. And I read a lot of science books from the Hastings Public Library and things. And I remember very clearly My mother denies this absolutely, but I remember that she said to me, girls can't be astronauts, especially not girls from New Zealand. She says she never said it, but I think it's in my memory anyway. And so after that is when I became a journalist.
So it's a second choice. It's not a bad second choice career.
Yeah.
So you're a single parent. So you've been bringing up your son in all these different cultures. How do you think that's influencing him?
That's funny because he thinks it's normal, right? He doesn't know anything different. So he was born in America, but he doesn't really remember living there. And then lived in Japan for 4 years, then China. So yeah, he thinks it's totally normal that you would be climbing the Great Wall and eating dumplings all the time, or like biking along the past Tiananmen Square or something. So he had always looked at New Zealand and thought that this was paradise. He'd never lived in a house before. He'd always lived in an apartment. So he just wanted a normal Kiwi life. And I think I did want that. I mean, even though I look at him and think his life is so much more, I don't know, varied and exciting than my childhood was. Yeah, he just wanted that security and that safety of, I guess, of having a normal life and staying in the same school the whole time and keeping the same friends the whole time. So I figure that the world is always there. He is always going to be a citizen of the world, and he can go back out, as can I, when the time is right.
Well, after COVID, there's probably not a better place in the world to be during COVID than New Zealand.
Yeah, it has been really good to be here. I mean, I could hardly have picked a better time to come home. And that people here keep asking me if New Zealand feels really small after where I was, but actually it doesn't, because we are living a big life. We're living a totally normal life where we can go to rock concerts with 30,000 people. And I went to my very first All Blacks game since I came home because I could. So it does feel really good to be here and to be able to live normally.
Do you miss that international lifestyle at all?
Well, not yet, because I was in China and I would be living a relatively normal life if I was in China, except that I wouldn't be able to leave the country. But from what I hear from my friends who are still there, it's just become even more difficult to work and to do journalism there. But then, my friends in the US are only now just beginning to send their kids back to school after a year of homeschooling. So I do not wish to be anywhere but here. Yeah.
And of all of your travels, whether they be work related or sort of your own personal choice, do you have a favorite kind of city or country that you've been to?
I really loved Iran. So I was supposed to be the Financial Times correspondent in Iran, so there had previously been a resident correspondent, and then I arrived at the time when they were kicking out journalists. So they let me stay for like 3 months, but on a short-term visa. So I always had to leave and come back. But for the time I was there, it was just so different from what you think it's going to be like, just so fascinating, and many people were so warm and welcoming, and it felt so rich culturally and historically. And yeah, I guess it was the surprise, the disconnect between how you think it's going to be and what it's really like. So I really loved being in Iran, and I would love to go back.
Is that the most surprising place you've been from that sort of perspective?
Yeah, maybe most surprising.
I never think of going to places like that. I'm not even sure how you get there. Do you need visas and stuff?
Oh yes, you need visas. But if you're not a journalist, was relatively straightforward. I mean, the other place not so far away from that I really love is Georgia. I have a very close friend who's from Tbilisi, Georgia, and that is just the most amazing country. Little country of 5 million like us, but very close to Iran, and lots of it's the perfect mix between East and West in many ways. So I'm looking forward to go visit my friend in Tbilisi when I can.
I think many of us are hoping to visit people overseas sometime in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
I don't think I've been at home this long since I was a teenager.
Yeah.
Hard though, isn't it? Because it's one of those things, because we're so lucky, and you kind of flagged it yourself, Anna, that we're in countries that have, you know, dealt with COVID in comparison to the rest of the world incredibly well. So we are living pretty much normal lives. And then you switch the TV on and see what's happening in places like Brazil and India. It's just frightening. And, you know, I guess the follow-on question from that is, how, as a journalist, when you're in, you know, sort of a country like New Zealand, when you're seeing things like this going on in other countries, is it something that you just feel compelled that you want to tell stories about it? Is it something that you kind of feel like it's a moral obligation? Or do you just kind of go, well, I'm in New Zealand and I can't really speak to what's going on in other countries?
I'm certainly fascinated with it, and I'm still reading a lot of international news and things like that. And really, I mean, yes, India and Brazil, I mean, Brazil, I guess we have more in common with, but I mean, the things that surprise me most of all are like the UK and Germany and Japan and countries where we think that are relatively well organized. And yeah, I mean, Japan has never had a proper lockdown, and so they are still, and Japan is a country of rules. Boy, they love rules. So the fact that they're still stuck in this COVID cycle now is really, really puzzling to me. But no, I don't. I mean, I was a foreign correspondent. I liked to go places and talk to people. So I don't have this great desire right now to write about these places because I'm not there. But I guess what I am trying to do in my new job as a newspaper editor in New Zealand is to bring a little bit of perspective to a lot of our reporting here, because so much of it is really so insular or so lacking in context. And so when there is one breach in an MIQ centre or something like that, everybody explodes about things. And I'm just like, there's always going to be one idiot somewhere who tries to escape out a hotel window or something. But like, look in the big context of things, how well we've done, and that we shouldn't be over dramatizing these kinds of things. So I guess, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, to put things in context.
I also wanted to ask you how you're finding the different role. Is this your first editorial role?
Yeah, it is my first editorial role. So again, I think it's not, I mean, it doesn't feel small, it feels big, because it's a whole new different skill, a whole new muscle I'm having to stretch. So I'm really enjoying editing and running a big newsroom and helping to shape coverage and helping reporters to develop their skills and feel like they're getting better every day. And I don't miss writing at all. I really felt like I'd run out of words. Well, I'd been doing my job pretty intensely, plus I wrote a book, and like getting up at 3:30 in the morning for a year to write for a couple of hours before I started my day job. So I really did exhaust all the words.
That's pretty big commitment. Tell us about that. Tell us about the book.
I wanted to write about Kim Jong-un because I was so fascinated with him, and I could see the world was so fascinated with him and knew nothing about him. But I set out to try to kind of write, I don't call it a biography because nobody can write a biography of Kim Jong-un, but I set out to try to piece together all of the information that we could get about him. But I did it while I was living in Japan and covering North Korea for the Washington Post, but I was still doing my day job. So I was always just collecting material, but I would have to get up really early in the morning to try to piece it together and just keep writing every day to write this book. Kim Jong-un kept getting in the way though, because I'd be sitting there at my computer at 5 o'clock in the morning and they would set off another missile or something during 2017, and I would be perfectly placed to file a breaking news story about it.
What is that like? So were you in Japan when some of those text messages were coming through saying,
yeah,
I can't imagine that moment. Jeez.
I was. Well, I'd lived in South Korea when, and South Koreans are very blasé about these things. They've been at war for 70 years. They're like, whatever, another missile. But Japan is much more responsive. I mean, some of these missiles were going over Japanese land or getting very close to in Japanese territory as well. So 2017 was really a time of heightened tensions. And
you had Trump in the mix too.
That's right. We had Trump, but there were like proper missile drills happening around the place and warnings going off, and Trump and nobody knowing how seriously to take him. And he's talking about fire and fury and locked and loaded. And I think a lot of people, in Japan, South Korea, China, didn't know how seriously to take him. And they did take him very seriously.
I took him at his word. I was glad we got through that.
It's the biggest thing to do, to be honest.
Yeah.
Glad we got through that regime.
Ooh, absolutely.
But doesn't it just feel so surreal now? And when you listen to a clip of him on the radio or something like that, like, was that really real? Did we really live through that period of the virus will go away and this kind of craziness?
Or we should all drink some bleach.
Yeah,
that was the best way to deal with things. It's fascinating, isn't it? Because I agree with you, Anna, on this concept of the Trump years being, how the hell did that happen? And what's joyful is now we don't have to sit there and wonder what he's going to tweet at 3:00 in the morning whilst watching Fox News. There's, no matter what your politics are, I don't really care one way or the other about the current president of the US, but I just like that he's boring.
Yeah. Wasn't it so great last week when he was speaking to Congress and everybody was just like, how competent and boring he is. Fantastic.
Yeah. Boring competence. It's all you need, really. Who could have predicted that? But I'm interested, when you were working for the Washington Post, were you ever based in DC?
Not for the Washington Post. I was based in DC for the Financial Times.
Oh, right.
Years.
So
I covered the second Obama election.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So were you on the road with them? And
yeah, so I followed Mitt Romney. My boss followed Obama during that thing. Yeah, so I went to a lot of election rallies and traveled around quite a lot. It was strange having gone from doing the Koreas and then Iran and then living in Lebanon and moving to Washington. I thought that it would be familiar and relatively easy. But I think actually America felt not the most foreign of them all, but very foreign to me. And as DC, even though it's a government town, it really is in the South or very close to the South. And so that social conservatism constantly surprised me in America, and going out and listening to people say why they had a right to bear AK-47s in Walmart. And, so the Second Amendment I never got. And even while I was there, and even worse since, the fact that abortion and a woman's right to choose is an issue in 2020 just seems insane to me, that they are so socially conservative. So it felt very foreign in a number of ways.
I'm fascinated by the way that was manufactured as an issue. It was never an evangelical issue until Roe v. Wade, and then they manufactured it into one. And so they've made it such a single issue for conservatives now, when they were not inclined to be concerned with that. It's really fascinating for me how
the additional part of that for me is that they care very deeply about, the child that is not yet born or alive, but then as soon as it's born, don't care about it at all.
Yeah, no welfare, no help for mothers.
No healthcare. Let it die.
Yeah, that's another thing, healthcare, which is just like a shibboleth in the United States, that you cannot criticize their healthcare. And it's great if you are rich and can afford great healthcare, but for everybody else, completely just mind-boggling to think that, the biggest cause of bankruptcy in the United States is medical bankruptcy. And I don't know how people can defend a system like that.
I know, and student debt, which is kind of crazy. So, I spent a lot of time in the US. Annie has too. I don't really want to go back there for a while. I want to see what happens next after Biden. What happens if they bring Trump back?
Hang on. Kate has a different theory as well, by the way, that it won't be Donald Trump. It will be a different Trump.
It could be any Trump. They're all the same.
Well,
even that, the fact that it's Bush, Clinton, Trump, and Biden. there's something wrong with that system, isn't there?
So it could be like Ivanka next, and then Hunter Biden or something.
Yeah, but I have to say, I was like pretty pessimistic about Biden, thinking, he's been around the block too many times, so it's time for some fresh blood in the Democratic Party and things. But I've been quite surprised by how bold he's been, like the things he's doing on climate change in particular. Maybe I've underestimated him or whatever, but maybe he will use his mandate for good now.
Yeah, and I think my hypothesis on that one is he pretty much is accepting that he's a one-term president, so he's got to get a wriggle on. And we do need something like, whether it's Kamala Harris or a different Democratic kind of lineage, to your point, we do need to break out of this same families just constantly getting into the presidential kind of role. It just doesn't serve the country at all.
Yeah. Well, New Zealand got its first female prime minister when the previous one stepped down. So maybe, this is a way as well to...
Here's a good question then, perhaps to kind of round this out. How do you, when you go from living in a country that has a Donald Trump or an incredibly, whatever the regime is of how you want to describe the Chinese kind of system, and then you come home to Jacinda Ardern, is that like a massive cultural shock?
It's not a cultural shock because I'd been following the news from abroad and things, but I guess it is, I think, like two things. So one thing that shocks me is that it's not about politics, but about the number of men in particular, but people who call her Cindy and things, this very sexist, gendered way of treating her. And so they call her Cindy or Aunt Cindy as pejorative to try to minimize her. So I think that's quite shocking, and it wouldn't happen with a male prime minister. I mean, the same thing, the people who were horrified that she had a baby in office. She's managed to do pretty well in terms of running the government. But then also now seeing her up close, like she is extremely skillful at communications, and like sometimes for good, right? Like we see during COVID and her messages to the people, we're all in this together, we all have to stay home, save lives, and these very simple messages that were really powerful. So she's a master communicator in that respect, but she's extremely controlling. She runs a very tight ship in the government here. There's like very little information that comes out, and her ministers and people around her are scared of her. Everybody has to go in and ask for approval to say something to a journalist or something like that. So, and from a journalist perspective, it's extremely difficult to get news because nobody talks.
That's a good government. That's impressive.
Yeah,
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, no, it's like even the deputy prime minister. There was a great interview profile of him in a magazine recently, and he was like, "Got to check with Jacinda," and like nobody would talk about him without permission, and they're a very tight ship. But I guess that's what's enabled them to get through this.
Oh yeah, and in Australia, we've got the leaking to everybody. We're just a shambles.
Well, we love that as journalists. We want to know what's going on, right? So it's or maybe the sweet spot is somewhere in between.
Australia is just hilarious. At least they've changed the rules so they can't just knife a prime minister overnight and you just find another one.
Yeah, you did go through
that was more fun.
It was like 5 in 5 years or something ridiculous. We're preposterous people.
Yeah.
And nothing changed. Like everybody's life just went on. It was really showed us how much they matter.
Fun times. So here's another question for you, Anna, to bring it back to you as a leader in your new role. Are there any other leaders out there that you look to for inspiration or for people who you think they're just incredible leaders?
I have been reading quite a few books and things about this. Well, the book that I have read that I had a big influence on me, which maybe you two know, is called Radical Candor. Yeah, I love that book, The Quadrant. So I've been reading that.
I don't know that book.
Yeah,
okay. I'm going to note that down.
It's great. Well, I think so. The woman who, this is going to sound quite sycophantic, but the woman who bought the company that I'm working for, I think she's a really inspirational leader. So her name is Janae Baucher. She was a journalist doing similar jobs to me and worked her way up and was the chief executive of the group when it was owned by Fairfax and was about to, collapse or be gobbled up by the other media company in New Zealand. And she bought it for $1. Of Fairfax. Yeah, so extremely audacious move and really gutsy for a journalist to do such a thing. But so I think, and she's changing the culture inside the company quite a lot and making it much more kind of, New Zealand values, I'd say. I was on a Te Reo Māori course with her tonight where we were all doing Māori lessons after work and things. So I think she is inspirational in the way she's trying to grow the brand and change the culture inside the company. So I think that, but when I got the job, I did talk to a whole bunch of editors for advice on how to be a good editor and things. And one of them was Lisa Davies, the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, who was really generous with her time and her advice and things. So I do look to other editors, but especially female editors, to see how they manage it.
Well, that is really interesting, and our time is up. So thank you very much, Anna. Really enjoyable to talk to you. Thanks, Annie. Yeah. Lovely to see you as always. Bye, everyone. We'll be back soon.
Thanks for having me on.